A detective for the Ohio State University Police said that the use of pepper spray to break up the fights at midfield after the game ended was necessary. Let's talk about what it is that he saw and whether or not you agree. What's up, kinfolk? It's RJ Young. I am not on a step mill. This is your first time watching the #1 college football show. Welcome. Thank you for joining us here. We talk college football year round, and I stumbled across a story that I think has kind of reached its natural end, which is what did we learn following the brawl to end Michigan's 16-13 win against Ohio State at the Shoe? And quite a lot, right? It was a black eye for the sport. It was a black eye for the Big Ten. It was not anything that anybody wants to see or wants to see ever again. It's also not coincidentally, I think, coming around a time for which it was always going to be hard for Michigan and Ohio State fans to feel okay about anything that happens over the next 2-3 years, even going back. And then just a couple years ago, we were talking about Penn State and Michigan getting into a tunnel brawl. Michigan State and Michigan getting into a tunnel brawl at the Big House. Now we're talking about players that saw Michigan taking the M flag and planting it at the Shoe to finish the win in a game that Ohio State was supposed to win going away, feeling some kind of way about that, going to midfield and doing more than having things to say. And I found it interesting how police got involved in this, because one of the first things that you see at the end of the game is a head coach and another head coach running towards center field to try to get to each other to shake hands, because that's what you do at the end of the game. It's sportsmanship, but beside them is usually some sort of security, whether it's a police officer or a hired security, to make sure that somebody who perhaps is not, shall we say, in their best frame of mind is trying to go and talk to and or get in the way of said handshake. Like you've seen the kids that will go onto the field with their phones to finish a big game, and a couple of them try to take shots at other players. Some of them just try to capture the scene. The end of a game is always a really intense and rowdy time, no matter what the outcome is. If the stadium is full, people rush the field all the time. At Ohio State, they were feeling some kind of way because before that game, they were expecting to play in the Big Ten championship and then for the national championship. That loss to Michigan basically made that impossible, right? So Michigan, who was not very good up until the last few weeks of the season, came into form right when they needed to, and they knocked off what would become the national champs. But before they could do that, Ohio State University Police and others got involved in breaking up this brawl. And one of the things that was mentioned by the police detective, Douglas Cunningham, who told The Athletic, look, we had to do something to get control of the situation, right? It was really getting out of hand. And one of the officers that used pepper spray made the point that, hey, look, I got a 300-pound person who's got protective gear on, and I'm using what I have at my disposal to use non-lethal means, right, to stop him. And I think that's the part of this that I think is important to emphasize. One of the first things that I learned and eventually come to teach as NRA basic pistol instructor is stop. I don't want to hurt anybody. I want to stop them from hurting me, right? And that is a measure of control that a lot of people just don't have. But when you are law enforcement, that's one of the first things that you were taught, right? There are ways to stop behavior. There are ways to get someone to sit still or to do what you ask without having to go all the way to the end of the spectrum and use means that could otherwise be means you regret, right? I think the use of pepper spray in this instance makes headlines because we don't talk about using pepper spray to stop fights on a sideline or at midfield, and we tend to think that that is evocative of a different kind of scene altogether, a much more violent scene, if you will. Like nobody forgets the Malice at the Palace at Detroit, where you had Detroit Pistons going into the stands, and Indiana Pacers going into the stands, fist fight with, customers, fans, what have you, whatever you want to call those folks, people that had too much alcohol. Nobody wants to see that. And I think the way in which this was done also kind of puts spotlight back where I think it needs to be, which is, are we doing everything we can to protect each other? And are we doing everything we can to protect players? Are we doing everything we can to protect coaches? I mean, At one point, we're talking about Ryan Day loudly getting shouted down as perhaps not to be the guy to coach Ohio State. And even when they're playing for the national championship game, there's a very interesting anecdote. Ryan Day getting home and telling security at his house, I think you can go home now, because they'd won the game, and obviously everybody is okay. And Ryan Day is being crowned as national champion and one of the highest paid coaches in the sport. But this is also part of this rivalry. Like, we cannot talk about the animosity and hate in this rivalry and expect it not to spill over. We cannot expect players to not feel this and play a violent game violently. We ask them to turn it off as soon as the whistle ends and turn into good, honest, authentic human beings. The heat of the moment being the heat of the moment, what it is, this could have been a lot worse, is my first thought. And I'm glad that Ohio State University Police went out of their way to say, look, this is the way that it happened. This is what we found. This is what we investigated for ourselves. This is what we think of this incident. And out of this, there have been all sorts of jokes. There have been all sorts of hand-wringing. And there's certainly been more shots taken by fans anonymously. Some of them in the comments of the channel right here on this show. But it kind of bring me back to this. What do you think, right? Do you think that pepper spray should have been used? Was there another means you can think of that perhaps merits use, right? I'm thinking he's not having an honest, heartfelt conversation with with any of these guys that are looking to throw hands. It always reminds me of the child that's throwing a tantrum in the supermarket, and you got a mom who is trying to reason with a 4, 5, or 6-year-old about, hey, we talked about this. You're not supposed to act this way at this particular juncture in this public setting. There are lots of different ways to handle that. That one doesn't necessarily get the result that you need right now, right? But nobody is going to ask you to go and hurt anyone to get them to stop, right? I think doing this segment is part of the catharsis of, frankly, that event. It's been 4 consecutive wins for Michigan against Ohio State. They can't stand it. They won the national championship, which makes them feel very good about it. But knowing that Michigan won the national championship the year before and they still managed to beat Ohio State in a year in which they're not supposed to, that's getting under people's skin. Now we're heading into a new era of college football where we don't even know if and when we're going to see any punishment for Sharon Moore and Michigan Wolverines for illegally stealing signs in 2023, basically over the past 3 years, the years in which they became a very, very good football program. It's just not a good look for them, right? But until that happens, Michigan fans get to continue to say, hey, look, they keep telling us the hammer is going to come, and we see no such hammer. We have heard no such peep. All we have seen is a notice of allegations and Michigan's response to those notice of allegations. And then we'll see what, if anything, the Committee on Infractions does or does not do. But that's taken however long it takes for them to get there. Perhaps it's one of those things where they're waiting until they're closer to the season to say what it is that they think ought to happen or to try to see that thing enforced. I think knowing that this sort of incident could occur is going to make us better about how we talk about the sport and how we talk about each other before and after these really big games. Like I would be very embarrassed if this happened at the Cotton Bowl between OU and Texas. I would not feel good about that at all. I don't think Ohio State fans or Michigan fans feel good about that either. I think you would like to think that these men would take it upon themselves to, hey, they won, they get to showboat, they get to do that. If you don't want that to happen, win the football game. You had opportunities to win it. You didn't. They did. And to the winner go the spoils. And one of the spoils that we have given to ourselves, dating back to Baker Mayfield planting that flag at the shoe as quarterback at Oklahoma, is planting a flag. But people forget the reason that flag plant was so important, and I think the reason it didn't become a brawl is, A, Baker did it a little bit later in the game, later toward the end of the game, right? So we'd had the coaches shake hands and we've had players disperse, and then he goes and does it, right? That's why you get a very clear vantage point of him doing it. The other thing to remember is that Ohio State had just come to Norman the year before and stomped a mud hole in the Sooners, just walked us dry. Urban Meyer went into Memorial Stadium and clocked Oklahoma 45-16. It was not fun. Baker remembered. Right? So it was much about vengeance and revenge as it was anything else. Michigan also continued to just beat up on a team that they've been beaten up on. So there was nothing to avenge for them, right? It was really, you're laying it on at a time when you don't need to be laying it on, but it is your right to lay it on. I would have liked to have seen Ohio State players either take a knee and watch it like you do because you're affected and you're trying to make sure that this moment never finds you again, or you just take it to the locker room, right? And hindsight, that's easy to do. But right then, right there, when you got to get police involved, you got to get police involved. And if they got to use pepper spray, then that's what they think they got to do. Now, let's make sure that we never, ever have that happen again.